My name is Beth Osnes, and I'm an assistant professor in the Theater and Dance Department, University of Colorado. What I do is I use theater as a tool for social justice issues. And primarily I use it for women, so that women can start to get a feel for their voices as being strong. Primarily it's for women who are living in oppression, maybe women who have been living in poverty, and for them to get a strong voice so that they can start to participate in public decision making. Because without a voice, without confidence to use your voice, you can't participate. So what I do is I give women, using theater exercises, they get a physical experience of their voices as being strong. And then with that kind of transformational experience, then we use that strong voice for them to declare their most passionate concerns in this workshop setting. And then we say, okay, this is your most passionate concern. How could you use your voice to start to act on your concerns? So then they strategize on that one way that they could do that in the next month. And then we say, okay, let's rehearse that action. And then they get to rehearse it in real time with real bodies, and they start to encounter some of the obstacles that they would likely encounter. And then together in this workshop community, they help each other come up with strategies to overcome these obstacles. But this is all using theater, and it's kind of like using theater to rehearse different ways reality can be. They start using these skits, these interactive skits. They're doing these interactive skits, and they're starting to see that they could be the authors of their own lives. That it doesn't have to be the status quo. It doesn't have to be the way it's always been. It doesn't have to just be one person in control, that they could step into decision-making roles too. So this is where the women and the population issue really comes together. Because as I see it, population impacts everybody, but on one level, it's really a woman's issue. Women, we're the ones having the babies. And on some level, when we get to step up and start making those decisions, then we're going to start finding some ways to stabilize our population. I think that women inherently know their limits, their community's limits, the resources that they have within their own family, and how many children they can really take care of in a way that those children will each have a viable life. I was working on a film on population, and we did our last shooting in Ethiopia. And we spent the couple weeks in the summer there and traveled around, and I think that I understood population intellectually, and I had all these social justice ideas around population, but being in a home in Ethiopia, in a rural home with a dirt floor, low ceilings, 10 children, and knowing that one of the children had died of AIDS in the home, and just looking at this mother and thinking, she just seemed, I was struck by how helpless she was over how many of these beautiful children she had born, and how desperately she wanted to care for each one of them, to give each one of them a shot, and how impossible that was given the amount of resources that she had at her disposal. That she was living in poverty, and just getting them an education, getting them more than a meal a day was an issue. And if she would have been able to plan her family, if it would have been in her culture to sit down with her husband and have a equal discussion about how many children they thought they could really do justice to, they'd have a much smaller family, and those children would probably have a more viable future. So I think that here, population is a huge issue. We all know that every American child consumes way more than any child who may be growing up in Ethiopia or some other developing country who's living in poverty. So I think that the population issue is really an issue for a lot of young women, or just women of childbearing years, who are going to be making these decisions that are going to collectively decide our future. They are deciding our future. They're going to decide how much pressure is going to be put on our planet and our resources. And I think that once women realize that responsibility, that we've been a people that have been traveling along in this limitless world, and all of a sudden, boom, we're starting to hit our limits and feel them in our lives. Like we've hit the limit of our energy resources, and we're consuming way more than we ever have in history. So we're at a place now where we see the limitations, and one of the biggest pressures that I've come to understand is the biggest pressure on every single issue to me seems to be population. And it seems to be the one issue that hits every single other issue. Environmental, social justice issue, poverty alleviation, education. In order to get those resources to that many people, you just create an impossible situation. That you're never going to be able to reach your goals, your social justice goals, if the population is expanding really kind of out of control. I think that for young women living in America today or in Colorado, it's about, when they're stepping into adulthood, it's about these big choices. Big choices that lock you into a certain level of consumption. Big choices like, am I going to accept a job that requires a 1-hour commute? Am I going to have 1 or 2 children biologically and maybe adopt or foster more kids in order to build a family? These are big choices that are going to lock us into levels of consumption that we're going to pretty much play out for maybe decades, maybe our whole lives. What kind of a house we buy, what kind of a car we buy, how we arrange our lives so that we're doing transportation. All those things lock us into things that it's pretty hard to get out of them once you've invested in a home. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to move out of those choices. I have to say just my own example of building a family. I think that a lot of young women are thinking, I'm not even thinking of that yet. But for when you move into those years where you start to thinking of building a family, I think that, my husband he had heard these talks by Al Bartlett about population years ago. And when we, got married and started having kids, he very explicitly and very lovingly said, let's talk about, I'd really like to only have 2 biological kids. Let's talk about this. And I wouldn't have done that. I came from a big family, and I wanted to kind of replicate this experience of plenty of so many people and this feeling of enough and really big community. And so I wanted that. And so for us, we talked about it, and then adoption was a really good way for us to start to build a family in a different way. And as we've lived, it's interesting that these choices have actually, I think, brought more connections, more love, and more happiness into our families. I think that when we lock ourselves into these high consumption lifestyles, that I think oftentimes we're not even as happy. Usually, huge consumption of fossil fuels, it keeps you so you're not even connected with people. I think of a trip we took to New Orleans, and we had so much fun because we took public transportation. And some of our best memories are those personal interactions we had on the bus that were just so funny. And we felt like we got the spirit of the city by riding public transportation. So you lock yourself off from experiences when you isolate yourself by consumption or by having a palatial home that pushes your neighbors away. I think also choices that we make when we're living, we just have to integrate these choices into kind of big choices into our life. We had a son move out of our house this year because he went to college. And we live in town, and we all get to ride our bikes and walk to work, and in town it's easy. And so we thought, well, let's open up our room to a renter. So we have a visiting professor who came to live with us now, and she's renting from us. And because she knew she was going to be living in town, she didn't bring her car from DC when she moved here for a year. So these kind of choices can ripple out and really change the level of consumption that's happening in our state of Colorado. So we can start designing our lives in these ways. When we make these choices that are good for our environment and good for the people, I think we often live a life that's more connected to people and the environment. I think of when I ride my bike instead of driving somewhere, just in Boulder. And I ride along oftentimes the creek path, and you see the sunlight shimmering on the water, and people are smiling at you, and you see friends. Whereas if I'm in my car, I'm hot, and I'm irritated by people and the traffic. So it's a different experience of life that we get when we live in a way that's more connected to our earth and to other people. One of the top solutions I think that we find to having our world get stabilized in terms of population and in terms of consumption is really strengthening women's voices so that they're more fully participating in how we're deciding to kind of do everything. Development work has shown us in the last decade, people have really come to realize that when you invest in a woman, you invest in the community. There are examples in development work, in sustainable development work, where someone will come into a community and ask the village elder, who's usually a man, and they'll say, well, where would we need lighting in the house here? And they go, oh, we need it over here. And because this is where we would plug in the television. Oh, do we need it over there in the kitchen? Oh, no, we don't need light there. Do we need it over there where the kids are studying? No, we don't need light there. But if you were going to ask a woman, where do you need light in your house? She would say, yes, I need it in the kitchen. Yes, I need it where the children are studying. So you get a different, when women are participating, they're often looking out for the children and the well-being of the community. And investing in them tends to keep, that investment stays in the community. When we've invested in men's education, they've often left their communities and gone to urban centers. We see that kind of again and again, and maybe even leaving their own countries and going to study and live somewhere else because they have that opportunity. But with women, they tend to stay in their communities more. And when you empower, you don't empower women, but when you give women the experiences, the tools, so that they can empower their own voices, then you start getting an advocate for the community, the well-being of the whole community. And that's when I think we really get to a place where we're going to create a stabilized world, where we're going to be having as many children as we all feel like we can take care of. We're going to be having levels of consumption that are a little bit more equitable. So like, one person doesn't get to consume a huge amount and the other person has nothing. It'll be a little bit more equitable. I think we'll be living within our means a little bit more. Moms are good at balancing a budget and making sure everybody gets fed. These are kind of the typical mother skills that we see that I don't think our society as a whole is cashing in on enough. I think if we started including women and mothers more in decision making, that they could bring that experience and that skill set that they have to our methods of peacekeeping or our methods of allocating resources or sharing resources or resolving conflicts. I think there's some really great things there that are much less wasteful that mothers could bring to the table. Well, I think when you're getting to supporting girls, what do girls need in order to work their way out of poverty and to be able to have some hope for their life? The top thing is education. Once we start to invest in girls and give them an education, give them access to education, really mentor them around that education, the programs that I see that are most successful around the world are the ones that not only give the girl the education, but also mentor her because she's shifting in a cultural way from one style of life that's maybe been going on for 1,000 years in her village to a new way of living, of her being educated, marrying later, maybe preparing herself for a job outside the home. There's a lot of big shifts that are occurring when you start to educate a girl. And for her to really be supported in that and to support her in her dealings with her father who may want to marry her off, or her mother who may feel like, well, I know I need you to come home and take care of the young ones with me. All these family expectations. For that girl to get support, those are the ones that really work. And then we see that those girls are delaying childbearing. They're oftentimes having fewer children that they can really support, and that their children are then having a chance to work their way out of poverty. So we really start to break the chain of poverty. The root cause of poverty that perpetuates itself over and over again gets broken when we start to educate girls. But we also need to get a world where there's going to be men who want to marry these girls. So there's a program in Guatemala that I've worked with that they're working with the boys too, to open their awareness and to teach them how to cook so that they can start to share child care duties, and so that both people could be working outside the home. And so it's a tricky thing because you're tipping cultural practices that have been going on for thousands of years. So it's you have to be careful, and you have to really work with the people, and you can't just come in with a good idea and insert it. You have to work within the culture and really be working in real authentic partnership with people in the community who can balance these things and set the pace that's going to be safe and healthy for everybody. One of the things I heard at a mothering convention that I went to was this woman said that her husband said, the greatest gift of the women's movement is that it gave fathers back their parenting. And I think that that's really true. When we start to really become partners in parenting, when it isn't just all loaded on the mother, you think, oh, well, the mother has the burden of taking care of the children. Well, actually, it's really cool to have connections with your children. And it's more rewarding. And you work so hard to raise your children. It feels good if you're really emotionally and connected to them. So I think that when men really step into nurturing roles, they're changed and they're rewarded in enormous ways. And I think it really starts to change the way our world is. I think we're going to resolve conflicts differently if men are really nurturers of humankind. I don't think we'll be getting another couple yards in a battlefield at the cost of so many lives if men are fully embracing nurturing and parenting and have that embodied understanding of the worth of a human life. So I feel like there's a transformation that's going to happen in our society when men fully step into parenting roles and share it with women. And I feel like, there are times when, our life was a little bit more traditional in that I stayed home when the kids were really small and cared for them mostly. And there were often times where I got the benefits from that because they wanted me, and it feels great when your kids want you. And this whole parenting thing, when men get included, that's a huge bonus. That's a cool transformation. And I think parenting has gotten kind of cool in the media now. Like, you see Ben Affleck holding his daughter or something. You see this, like it's cool now to be a parent. So I think that our young people are getting different role modeling than we did. You didn't see men with a baby on their hip and that was sexy. Now it is. So I think that the world is changing, and I think there will be a lot of good things that will come from this. I think it'll help open it up that women have different choices that aren't just like so antagonistic. I think we saw the women's movement as very antagonistic, that now it can be more in partnership, men and women in partnership, creating families that can be really sustainable. I think that growth gets a bad reputation sometimes. We think that we can't have a world where there's growth because we've got these limitations. But growth can keep happening in alternative ways. I think of, I'm doing a project now in the Navajo Nation where there's 18,000 families without access to electricity. There's a huge potential for growth in giving them access to renewable sources of energy. We're working with these small-scale solar lights, and this is just one small way that getting people access to lights that will be able to allow them to function after the sun goes down, to be able to do anything in your home, to not use dirty burning kerosene. So the idea that growth can have really fun potential, but it can go in these kind of alternative ways, renewable energies. There's huge opportunity for growth there. There's huge opportunity for growth in the way that we resolve our conflicts, in the way that we govern ourselves. Now that we've changed so much, we're kind of a global community now, we've got to start changing how we're governing ourselves as a global community. So there's growth in that. That's fun. Economic growth. It doesn't have to be, economic growth doesn't have to mean the numbers go up. It could mean that we're growing in another way of doing it, like the slow money movement, related to the slow food movement. All these things, that's growth we're growing in the way that we're thinking. But it doesn't have to just be the numbers and the profits that are growing. It can be our understanding that's growing and our alternative ways of using resources or distributing resources. So I think that growth can be looked at in a way that is something that's really humankind's growing in its understanding of how it can live in peace together and really have quality of life. So I think we've been thinking of growth only as increase in profits for a few at the peril of the many. So I think that we could start thinking of growth in different ways, in more humanitarian ways. My friend Jo Ellen was telling me that it hit her one day when she was making an organic lunch for her children to take to school with her organic peanut butter and all these good, healthy foods that she was packing in a lunch for her children, for them to have good nourishment, that she needed to simultaneously be making sure that they were going to have good air to breathe in the future, making sure that they were going to have a life in which there weren't countries wanting to have war with them. That she realized that taking care of her children was taking care of these larger issues, like the world they're going to inherit. With so many people in the developing world really moving up into a middle-class lifestyle, and we've got huge numbers of people moving up with our growing economy and with the population growing, and they're really looking to the West to see what did that middle-class lifestyle look like. And I think that we have an opportunity in the West to be emulating a middle-class lifestyle that is different, that doesn't exert more pressure on the planet. Maybe a middle-class lifestyle that shows working at the community garden, that shows how fun and connected it feels to ride your bike to school with your kid. That emulates these things that really create healthy living and a healthier community and a healthier environment. So in March, I was in India showing the population film that I had worked on. And we showed it to multiple audiences. And I found myself over and again having to defend our country to fellow Indians that I was speaking with about why it is that we don't talk about population. And it was kind of interesting. And I said, I think that we in America, this was my best guess, that we in America can't imagine a way that we could stabilize our population without using coercive methods like China used. I don't think that we can imagine another way. And I have to say that until I was involved in this film project on population, I didn't really get that empowering women was the surest way to stabilize our population. And that empowering women actually has other really positive benefits that come along with it. It adds to the health of developing communities. It adds to so many better lifestyles for women who are living under incredible oppression. And so I thought, I didn't know that. And I think that if America knew that you could stabilize population in such a positive way, I think more people would be up for talking about it. I think we're afraid to talk about it because it's around a lot of taboo issues of freedom of the individual And I suspect that in America we have an overdeveloped sense of individual and maybe an underdeveloped sense of community. And I think that if we kind of expanded our notion of community, we could start to see how personal choices really impact the health and well-being of the whole community. And the health of the whole community impacts us. So it's a full circle. So it was just interesting to be in another country and to have to defend your own nation and start to make sense of it, because you realize we think of India as being backwards or as being a developing nation, and then I look at, they're so much farther along than we are in talking about things that are so important to our society. So I felt like, well, who's behind here? It was interesting, when I was in India, I was talking with, obviously it was, more educated people. And I think that when they were looking at the film and looking at this whole idea of how consumption is based with, is interlaced with population issues, and how there's different impact of, one person living a high, above middle class lifestyle is having way more impact than 20 people who are living at a very, subsistence level life. That they were thinking that, well, the US are the people that are really over consuming. And I think that when they saw the movie, they were realizing, oh, I'm living that lifestyle. I'm driving a car. I may be living in India, but I'm a consumer at that level as well. So I think it was an interesting conversation that several times people brought up that fact that, oh yeah, if I'm living at this economic level, I'm consuming that much. So that was interesting. I think when I was growing up, I grew up in a big family in a small community in Wisconsin. And us having a big family, it was kind of like this indicator that we were like healthy, that we had enough, that we were like a happy place, that we were somehow good people because we were Catholic. Having a big family meant you were good Catholics. And I think that I have a lot of positive associations around big family. And so when I stepped into making my own family, I realized that, that we can still have these same, we don't have to give up our family ideals. We just have to change the way that we're going to achieve a big family. This past year we had my own 2 birth kids, the kids that I had biologically, my adoptive daughter, and then 2 other teenagers who needed a place to live, living in the house. And it was a big family feel, but it was an alternative way of gathering together a family. So I think that there's certainly enough need in this nation that we can all be, like, if you just relax your boundaries the smallest amount, family will rush in. So I think that there's opportunities for us to replicate these values that we harken back to an earlier age in America, that we kind of idealize and think we're nice, that we can still have those in alternative ways, still achieve them in a way that doesn't negatively impact population. So in this class, we were using theater as a tool to explore the issue of population. So we were saying, well, what's going to happen if we keep growing at the levels that we are with population? Let's start to imagine what that reality might look like in the future. So the students generated this circumstance in which you might need to have random selection of some people having to be sterilized, that they wouldn't be able to procreate, or that there would be really strict limits about how they would be able to procreate. And that to make it fair, we should probably make it random, because we don't want to do it by economic level, like if you're poor, you can't procreate or something. So we thought we'd make it fair, so we'd just make it random based on Social Security number. And so we decided to dramatize. What would this look like if you were being given the news that you were chosen? So we put this skit into motion, and it brings up, and the thing that's so fun about doing it with theater is it's not just an intellectual exercise. That people start to get engaged at a very emotional, almost physical level, and their beliefs come into play, and all these things come into play, their values, their hopes, their dreams. So it really engages the full person when you set it out in a full theatrical setting. You start to see how the lived version of that would be. And then you start to think, okay, how do we need to change our lives now so that we don't end up with that being our future? So in the skit, we have this young couple who has 1 child, and they're still of childbearing years, that they are called into this office. They're asked to come in, and then they're notified that they've been selected to be the population reduction couple, so that they can't have any more. And then it was random, and she tries to very kindly explain the social needs around this, that they're living in a world that just needs to be so, and then their reaction. And you start to, it causes you to really be able to have empathy with the couple who's being told this, but then you also see the need for it in this kind of fictionalized, futuristic world. So you really start to feel the weight of these choices that we're making now around population and how they might play out decades from now or maybe even 100 years from now. So there's some kind of game rules we come up with for these kind of improvisational skits. And one of the ways we like to get multiple perspectives on this is you can have one person being a character within the skit. And then if you think of something you'd like to say of that character, you'd wish they'd say that, you can come up behind that person and tap them on the shoulder. And then they have to leave and you become that person without breaking the conversation, letting the action just continue. So it's a fun mechanism to get a lot of multiple perspectives on one skit, and it can kind of ebb and flow, and you can get a lot of different insights can come in from the clash of two sides, two characters on either side of an issue. So in the skit, we had one man who is a student here who uses a wheelchair and has a service dog. And he came into the skit at one point while we were doing it and said, oh, so you're going to try to, I think you're just doing it to me because I have a disability and that you're trying to be prejudiced against me. So it worked in well because, we have a history of these kind of things of, forced sterilizations, or we have histories that's questionable of things ways that we've tried to select who should get to procreate and who should not. The way that we set up the skit was that we had a couple who had one baby, but they were still of an age that they could have more kids. And they were called into the office, and the official woman there said, you've been randomly selected, and it's been decided that you and your wife and your husband, that you cannot have any more children, and that is going to be disallowed, and that because they were randomly selected. And the couple, of course, reacts very negatively to this because they feel like they're being controlled, and yet you see the point of the woman who is the official, that she's saying, well, we live in a world now where we just can't support, we don't have enough resources to support that many people at this standard of living. So you really, through the skit, you get to see both people's point of view, and you get to empathize with the couple. You mainly empathize with them, and you think, wow, what if that happened to me? What if I was told I wouldn't be able to have any children in my lifetime? That would really change how I feel about my life and my hopes and my dreams. So it was a cool way to engage the full person, the full being, your full emotional life. I think what the skit did was it brought people to a place where they realized that their individual rights might be limited if our population keeps growing at the rate that it's growing. And that was like, whoa. Like, even though there might be younger people thinking, I'm not thinking about having kids yet, but they wanted to have that option. And when they imagined themselves as older, they didn't want to imagine themselves as being limited in such a coercive, authoritarian way. And that rubs against the American character. That's kind of who we are. We're these cowboys who are individualistic, and we are rights, and we think our government is there to protect our individual rights primarily. So it really started to think, well, what if the government was saying, no, in order to sustain the community, in order to keep the community viable, we're going to need to limit your individual rights to have children. So it made people think about what our future is going to look like if we keep growing at the rate that we do. I think part of this is like changing the culture of reproduction, of how we get together as couples and decide to have kids, or as individuals even deciding to have kids. The landscape of how people are creating families and building families is really changing. I have one dear friend of mine who is my age, and her husband was a sperm donor, and now he has 10 kids who are contacting him as though he's a very important person in their lives. And he's got 3 kids of his own, and it's like, oh, that's like a lot. Like, we're changing, like, is he a father to them? Like, we're changing these ideas of what the landscape is changing. So I think that young people today can really change the culture of how we think about creating a family. I know that I've had so many, because I have an adopted daughter, and I've had so many times where especially little girls will come up to me and say, my mommy wanted to adopt a kid, but my daddy wouldn't let her. So I think that there's like a gender thing around, there's a lot of women I know who would adopt another kid in a heartbeat or be willing to do foster care. And we got to grow as a culture for men to be maybe more open to raising children who aren't biologically their children. And that's a cultural thing. It doesn't mean men are bad and women are good. It just means that culturally we've been handed this set of values. And we can change it. We can change culture. We can change cultural norms. We're free to do that. And we can change them. Usually we change them when we're confronted with limitations or the resources that we have change. So we kind of change how we live. So I think that, our planet has changed in how many resources it has So we can change how we make families. And it isn't even a bad thing. You know, we love change. We think we're always afraid of change, but we love change. We love to hear about the latest pair of tennis shoes that I could buy and change my shoes or change my workout or change. You know, we love change. So if we could come across, you know, we can just really highlight the positive outcomes of alternative ways of building a family. You know, we could really grow and prosper. I know that, you know, when my 2 kids were younger, we had a teenage foster daughter. And I know that my 2 kids are better people because they had to give up their room or they had to stretch and witness her life and understand a part of life that they never would have understood. They're better people because of that. So there's ways, you know, we think we want these tidy lives, but tidy isn't that fun. Tidy is kind of boring. And I think young people, you know, they can look at us middle-aged people and they go, ah, it's boring. But, you know, when you stretch outside, then you get a little, it's more interesting. You got something to talk about at a party. I think of what I get to do in my life right now, and it's like I just know that I am incredibly lucky to be living when I am right now. Because a woman with my level of appetite wouldn't have had these opportunities. You know, you wouldn't have been able to socially be acceptable and be congratulated in social realms if you were stepping outside and working. And, you know, and my husband wouldn't have been of the culture that he would have stepped up and really, you know, my husband does all the laundry. You know, like that wouldn't have happened. So this is only possible. I only get to participate in life this much because the culture has shifted. So I think that it can keep shifting to really, you know, meet the challenges of the day and to really increase the happiness of the day. I think that a lot of people are realizing that it's fun to have 1 kid or 2 kids, or, you know, that adoption is actually kind of a cool thing, that it's not some choice that you make if you couldn't have a child, that it's a really, that adoption can be a choice that enriches your life. Our daughter is adopted and from South Africa, and it's expanded our life incredibly and brought more love into our family and expanded our lives, our community's family lives, and our, you know, it's in every way it's been a positive thing that is interesting. So I think that we can start to see these alternatives as not just, oh, I have to do this because we have challenges, but as opportunities to try a different way. When we were in Ethiopia, I visited this family that had 10 children. And the reason we were visiting this family was because the oldest daughter of that family really was inspired by these radio dramas that she had heard about women empowering themselves. And she decided that she did not want to marry young to a much older man that would have brought wealth to their family. She said, no, I do not want to do that. And she refused to marry him. She stayed in school. And her father was, of course, upset at first when she wouldn't marry the man. But now she stayed in school, so she's generating income that is really like the main support of the family. So the father's starting to change his idea of, oh, maybe this is a cultural value. Keep my daughter in school, keep the kids in school, because then I get more income. So, you know, cultures can change, and then the neighbors are witnessing this. So the change can happen slowly, but the girls who are getting these educations need to, at the same time, get the support of their families and their communities in order for them to be able to feel good about these changes. My husband, JP, was a student at the University of Colorado in the 1980s. And he, like many other students at CU, got to hear Al Bartlett give his talk on population. And he credits that talk as one of the things that when we were, you know, married and young and had our first son, that he said, I'd really like for us to talk about just really only having 2 biological kids. And it's just kind of amazing, you know, like talking about population can make a difference. You know, and like there's proof right there that it matters to talk about it and to take it out of this place of silence and to take it out of taboo, something you don't talk about in public or even with your spouse. You know, a lot of times, like even when we were in Ethiopia, they said that one of their goals was to increase spousal communication around family planning. And I think it's interesting that even in the US, I don't know that we're really so great at having spousal communication. You know, like I don't know that we are so comfortable about talking about these things. But I think to increase that, to make that more culturally acceptable and to, you know, as the parents to start talking about it, for the kids to start asking your parents questions, talk to each other about it, you just talk about it. You know, silence, not talking about it has got us to the point where we are now. Let's see what, you know, talking about it could really change the way we are. It's interesting to me as I get smarter as a human being that I realize how interconnected all of these issues are. I used to think that climate change was over here, population was over here, maybe poverty eradication was over here. And now I'm starting to see that they're really all one big issue, and they're interrelated, they're braided together. So when you're talking about population, you're looking at the number of people who are going to be impacting our climate and our world. So I'm really interested in the idea of climate change. Also, as I see how much it affects people who are living in poverty, the climate change is going to slam those people hardest who did the least to create climate change, human-caused climate change. And so I'm getting together with another professor in environmental studies, Max Boykoff, and we're going to be team teaching a course called Inside the Greenhouse. And we're going to be using media to celebrate positive solutions for climate change. Inside the greenhouse is this idea that, inside a greenhouse, we're inside this greenhouse gas effect. We're on this earth. But you also think of a greenhouse as a place where new ideas can sprout. So we're kind of using that double meaning of the greenhouse. And we are creating this class where we'll be making these two television programs that will be interviewing high-profile people and then other people as well, kind of using their celebrity to shine a light on other people's work too, who are creating these kind of positive, tangible solutions to climate change. I think a lot of the changes that we need to make as a global family now, we think of as being kind of a bummer. But I have to say that I think that a lot of these changes that we have to make are going to bring us more joy and more connection to each other and to our earth.